I remember the exact day, because the sky had the flat, tired look of old tin, and the cold rain was spitting just enough to make you feel miserable. It was Monday, April 2nd, a few years back now. I was at the co-op picking up seed potatoes and a bag of lime when I saw it. Tucked behind a display of shiny new rototillers was a cardboard box, stained and sagging, with a sign handwritten in black marker. Asparagus crowns, 300 count, as is, $10. I looked inside. They were a sorry sight. A tangled mass of pale, stringy roots and shriveled tops, looking less like future plants and more like something a cat had dredged up. They looked defeated. Dale Haskins, who's run the co-op since his father retired, saw me looking. "Don't bother with those, Martha," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Got left on the truck over the weekend, dried right out. They're bound for the burn pile." I nudged one with my finger. It felt brittle, but there was a strange weight to the mass of them, a density that didn't quite match their dead appearance. I thought of my grandmother's old garden ledger, a phrase from it surfacing in my mind like a smooth stone in a creek bed. "How about $6 for the box?" I asked. Dale laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, more of a pitying one. The kind of sound a man makes when he sees a woman about to waste her time and effort on something hopeless. $6? Martha, you could have them for free if you'll haul them away. But if you insist on paying for your trouble, $6 it is. He took my money, a 5 and a single, and shook his head as he helped me load the sad, dusty box into the back of my truck. "You buying weeds now, Martha?" he called out as I closed the tailgate. I didn't answer. I just gave a little wave and drove off, the box rattling behind me. I remember the weight of his doubt more than the weight of the crowns. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Right, the drive home. The whole way, I wasn't thinking about Dale's laugh. I was thinking about a piece of ground on my farm we call the North Slope. It's a 2-acre patch that tilts away from the sun, and it has been a source of quiet frustration in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather tried putting it in corn back in the 40s. The stalks grew pale and spindly, never making a decent ear. My father, in the 70s, tried soybeans. The plants yellowed and stunted by July, the soil a hard, cracked plate of pale clay by August. He called it the punishment patch. After he gave up, it went to pasture, but even the clover and fescue struggled there. The soil was tight, he'd say. It held water when it should release it, and shed it when it should hold. It was problem ground, the kind of land that makes a farmer feel foolish. For years, that patch just sat there, growing little more than thistle and a bit of thin grass. Every time I'd drive the tractor past its edge, I'd feel that same old sense of defeat. It was a family failure, written right onto the land. But tucked away in a cedar chest in the attic was my grandmother's garden ledger, a blue cloth-bound book filled with her elegant, spidery handwriting. I'd found it after my mother passed, a record of a life spent paying attention. And in that ledger, on a page dated 1938, was a single entry that had stuck in my mind for over a decade. It was written under the heading, "For the North Slope." It began with an aphorism she must have inherited herself, one I'd read 100 times. "Don't judge the harvest by the leaf," she wrote. "Judge it by the quiet work underground." For 10 years, I'd let that idea sit. For 10 years, I'd looked at the north slope and seen only my father's frustration. The work she described seemed monumental, almost biblical in its scope. It felt like the kind of project you start in your youth, not in your 60s. The memory of my father, a strong and capable man, walking away from that field, shaking his head, was a powerful deterrent. The conventional wisdom was that the north slope was simply poor ground. Thin topsoil over dense, acidic clay. Not enough sun. Bad drainage. A lost cause. To try and fail there again felt like it would be dishonoring his struggle, proving him right in the most painful way. So the ledger stayed in its chest, and the north slope stayed fallow. Then came that day at the co-op, seeing those wilted, forgotten crowns, destined for the burn pile. Something shifted in me. It felt like a sign, a dare from the universe. They were a lost cause, and the north slope was a lost cause. Maybe two lost causes could make a right. That evening, I made a pot of coffee and called my oldest friend, Sarah. Sarah's not a farmer. She's a retired librarian. But she has a mind for logistics and a healthy skepticism that keeps me grounded. I told her about the crowns and the north slope. I told her what I was thinking of doing. She was quiet for a long moment. I could hear her sipping her tea on the other end of the line. "Martha," she said finally, her voice even, "your father was no slouch. If he couldn't get anything to grow there, what makes you think you can?" "My grandmother left notes," I said, "a whole system. A system from before they had soil testing kits and modern fertilizers?" "Yes," I said, "that's the point." I walked her through it, reading straight from the ledger I'd brought down from the attic. The book smelled of cedar and thyme. My grandmother's instructions were not for the faint of heart. She didn't write about simply planting the asparagus. She wrote about remaking the earth beneath it. "They say it is poor ground," her script read. "It is not poor. It is only tight. The answer is not on top. It is 3 feet down." The plan was specific. It called for trenches, not furrows, but trenches, each one to be dug 18 inches wide and a full 36 inches deep, a yard deep, into that dense, unforgiving clay. She listed the dimensions, the spacing, the amendments. It was an engineering plan for soil. 36 inches deep? Sarah's voice was incredulous. For 300 plants? "Martha, that's not gardening. That's an excavation. You'll need a backhoe." "She did it with a shovel," I said quietly. "Her and my grandfather. The journal says it took them the better part of a month." "And what goes in these trenches?" Sarah asked, her librarian's mind kicking into gear, demanding facts. I read her the list. A 6-inch layer of field stones at the very bottom. Not gravel, but stones the size of a fist to create a drainage channel. On top of that, a mixture of the excavated clay, rotted straw from the barn loft, coarse sand from the creek bed, and ash from the winter's wood stove. All mixed together and layered back in. It wasn't a trick. It was a system. A system designed to solve the exact problem my father had named. Soil that wouldn't drain and wouldn't breathe. The deep stones would create a void for excess water to go, a French drain running the length of each row. The sand and straw would break up the clay's structure, creating pockets for air and preventing it from compacting back into a solid mass. Sarah was silent again. "That's a tremendous amount of work, Martha. Are you sure you're up for it?" Her question wasn't a judgment, It was a genuine concern. It was the question I had been asking myself for a decade.
"I don't know," I said.
And it was the most honest thing I'd said all day. But I paid $6 for the crowns. I feel like I owe them a chance. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and cold. I put on my work boots, grabbed a spade, a 5-gallon bucket, and a ball of twine, and walked out to the north slope. It looked just as it always did, pale, dormant, and uninviting. The grass was thin, a faded brownish green. I stood at the bottom of the gentle slope and just looked for a while, feeling the damp chill seep into my coat. This wasn't just about planting asparagus. This was about having a conversation with a piece of ground that had defeated my family for almost a century. I started not with digging, but with reading. Not the book, but the land itself. I walked the 2 acres, back and forth, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. I found the lowest point, where a faint, dark line in the grass showed where water tended to run off after a heavy rain. I kicked at the soil in a dozen different places. It was all the same. A thin layer of dark but weak topsoil, maybe 4 inches deep if I was being generous. Beneath that, the color changed to a pale, yellowish tan. The clay. I chose a spot and pushed my spade into the earth. The first few inches were easy. Then the spade hit the clay layer and stopped with a dull thud. It was like trying to dig into a block of drying soap. I put my weight on the spade's shoulder, rocking it back and forth. It sank another inch, then another. I pulled out a chunk of the soil and held it in my hand. It was heavy, slick, and cold. I squeezed it, and water oozed between my fingers, but the clay held its shape, a perfect, dense sausage in my palm. My grandmother was right. It was tight. It held water, but didn't absorb it. There was no air in it, no life. I spent 2 days just marking out the rows. 5 rows, each 60 feet long, running straight down the slope, not across it, just as the journal specified. This went against modern advice about contour plowing to prevent erosion, but her logic was clear. The trenches needed to act as drains, and drains work with gravity. I used stakes and twine to make my lines perfectly straight. Dale Haskins drove by on the county road once, slowed his truck down, and just stared for a minute before driving on. I could feel his curiosity from 100 yards away. Then the digging began. I decided against renting a backhoe. Sarah was right. It would have been faster. But the journal was specific about mixing the excavated soil with the amendments. A machine would just pile it all up in a useless heap. This had to be done by hand, layer by layer. It was part of the system. The first trench was a lesson in humility. The first foot was hard work. The second foot was a battle.
By the time I was trying to get from 24 to 36 inches deep, I was in a world of pure, stubborn clay. The trench was too narrow to stand in comfortably. I was on my knees, using a small hand trowel and a bucket to lift the soil out. Each bucketful felt like it weighed 50 pounds. It took me 6 days to dig that first 60-foot trench. 6 days of rising before the sun, working until my back and shoulders screamed, and falling into bed with my hands aching and swollen. My hands, which I thought were tough from a lifetime of farm work, blistered and then bled, and then formed new, deeper calluses. During that time, I established a rhythm. Dig for an hour, then haul amendments. I took the old pickup down to the creek that marks the southern edge of our property. The sand there was coarse, gritty,
perfect. I shoveled it by hand, one 5-gallon bucket at a time, until the truck bed was loaded down. It took 4 trips to get enough sand for just one trench. I climbed into the barn's old hayloft, a place I hadn't been in years, and forked down mounds of straw that had been rotting there since my father's time. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of decay. I filled wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow. From the house, I brought out buckets of cold ash I'd saved all winter from the wood stove, gray and fine as flour. Slowly, methodically, I began to fill the first trench. First, the stones. I gathered them from the old rock piles at the edge of the woods, where my grandfather had thrown them when he first cleared the land. I laid them in the bottom of the trench, a solid 6-inch bed of round gray field stones. Then I started mixing. In a wheelbarrow, I combined 1 part excavated clay, 1 part creek sand, and a 1/2 part rotted straw. I'd sprinkle in a scoop of wood ash and mix it all together with a shovel. It was heavy, clumsy work. The resulting mixture was nothing like the slick clay I'd dug out. It was darker, looser, with a texture that felt alive. It smelled loamy and rich. I shoveled this mixture back into the trench on top of the stones until it was filled to about 8 inches below the surface of the ground. Then I let it sit. The journals said to let it settle for a week, to let the rain water it in. And it did rain, a gentle, soaking spring rain that lasted for 2 days. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the dark line of the trench drink in the water. The ground around it was puddled and slick, but the trench itself showed no standing water. It was working. It took me 5 weeks. 5 weeks of bone-tiring, repetitive labor. I dug, I hauled, I mixed, I filled, 1 trench at a time. By the end of April, I had 5 parallel lines of prepared soil scarring the north slope, each one a testament to 60 feet of back-breaking work. They looked like fresh graves. While I was working on the 3rd trench, a white county vehicle pulled up my drive. It was Mr. Peterson, a young man from the extension office, all sharp-creased trousers and earnest enthusiasm. He'd replaced the old agent who knew my father. He got out of his car holding a clipboard. "Ma'am," he said, trying to be polite, "I was just driving by and, well, I have to admit I'm curious about your project here." I leaned on my shovel, catching my breath. "I'm putting in asparagus," I said. He looked at the deep trench beside me, then at the piles of sand and straw. He frowned. "This is a very intensive method for asparagus. Most commercial growers now are using no-till methods with raised beds, much better for soil health and far less labor." He tapped his pen on his clipboard. "And you're running your rows with the slope. You're going to have significant erosion issues here, especially with this kind of soil disturbance." I just nodded. "It's an old method." "I see," he said, though it was clear he didn't. "Well, I'd recommend getting a comprehensive soil test done before you go any further. We can do that for you. It's only $40. It'll tell you your pH, your nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus levels. That way you're not just guessing." "I know what the soil is," I told him. "It's tight. I'm making it looser." He gave me a tight, professional smile. "Right. Well, just be careful. A project this size, you want to be sure you're setting yourself up for success." He handed me a pamphlet on modern small-scale perennial crop management, got back in his car, and drove away. I watched him go, feeling a familiar wave of fatigue. Not from the digging, but from the effort of trying to explain the invisible. He saw trenches and labor. He didn't see the stones at the bottom. He didn't see the system. He saw a foolish old woman making a mess on a worthless piece of land. After he left, I looked at the pamphlet. It was full of glossy photos of tractors, plastic sheeting, and chemical fertilizer recommendations. I folded it in half and put it in my pocket. It felt slippery and thin. Finally, it was time. The first week of May. The 5 trenches were dug, filled, and settled. I brought the box of asparagus crowns out from the cool of the cellar where I'd been storing them. I opened it up and looked at them again. They still looked like a tangle of dried spiders. Following the journal's instructions, I filled a washtub with lukewarm water and gently submerged the crowns, letting them soak for exactly 1 hour. No more, the journal warned. You want to wake them, not drown them. After an hour, I lifted them out. They looked better. Not plump, but more pliable. The pale roots seemed to have a little more color, a little more life in them. I carried them out to the north slope in a bucket. The planting itself was delicate work. I dug a shallow furrow down the center of each prepared trench. Then, one by one, I took a crown and carefully spread its roots out in a circle, like arranging the spokes of a wheel. I placed them 18 inches apart, just as instructed. 300 crowns, 60 to a row. It took all afternoon. As I worked, I could feel the difference in the soil. It was soft and forgiving under my hands, nothing like the hard clay that surrounded it. The last instruction for planting was the most counterintuitive. Cover them with only 2 inches of fine soil, my grandmother had written. They must reach for the sun. You will fill the rest later. So I did. I gently sprinkled just a couple of inches of my loamy mix over each crown, leaving them buried in what were still, for all intents and purposes, shallow trenches. When I was done, the 5 rows were barely visible. It looked like I had done almost nothing. The sum of 5 weeks of Herculean effort was 5 faint lines on a barren hillside. That first summer was a trial of patience. A few weeks after planting, thin, spindly spears began to push through the soil. They were no thicker than a piece of knitting yarn. They looked fragile and weak. I could imagine Dale Haskins' smirk, Mr. Peterson's knowing shake of the head. But they grew. They reached for the sun and unfurled into delicate, feathery ferns. In July, as the journal instructed, I added 2 more inches of soil to the trenches, carefully burying the base of the ferns. This, she explained, encourages the crown to build more buds for the following year. The first year is for the roots, she wrote. Do not be tempted to harvest. Let all strength go down. So I didn't harvest. I weeded. I watched. The ferns grew to be about 2 feet tall, a sparse, lacy green against the dark soil of the trenches. It didn't look like much. My neighbors, driving past, would slow down, and I knew what they were thinking. All that digging for a patch of weeds. The north slope still looked more like a project than a patch. The late summer sun would bake the undisturbed clay between the rows into a pale, cracked armor, making the green lines of my trenches look even more out of place. The contrast was stark. Autumn came, and the ferns yellowed and died back. I cut them to the ground, leaving the rows looking empty again. The winters settled in, blanketing the north slope in snow. There were nights that winter, long, cold, silent nights, when doubt crept in like a draft under the door. I'd lie in bed and see Mr. Peterson's face, hear Dale's laugh. I'd think of the sheer brute force of the labor, the weeks of digging, the strain on my aging body. What if they were right? What if it was all for nothing? What if my grandmother's memory was flawed, or her success a fluke of weather and luck that I couldn't replicate? The weight of a century of failure on that piece of land felt heavy in the dark. On one of those nights, sometime in February, I couldn't sleep. I got up, put on my robe, and went to the living room. The blue ledger was on the mantelpiece. I picked it up and sat in my father's old armchair, the one with the worn arms. I turned to that page from 1938 and read it again, my finger tracing her careful script in the dim light of a single lamp. And there it was, the anchor. "Don't judge the harvest by the leaf," she had written. "Judge it by the quiet work underground." I closed my eyes. I pictured the trenches under the snow. I pictured the stones creating that vital channel. I pictured the sand and straw, holding the clay particles apart, creating space for air and water. I pictured the 300 crowns sleeping in that dark, friable earth, their roots stretching out, building strength, unseen. The work wasn't in the spindly ferns I had seen. The work was happening 36 inches down. I decided right then, in the quiet of that winter night, to trust the work, to trust her. I went back to bed and slept soundly. The second spring arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation. The snow melted and the ground thawed. I walked out to the north slope every day, watching. The first signs of life came in mid-April, but this time it was different. The spears that pushed through the soil were not thin and wispy. They were thick, some as thick as my little finger. They emerged with a strength and vigor that startled me. The color was a deep, vibrant green, not the pale shade of the previous year. The journal had instructions for the second year, too. A taste, it said. Harvest for 1 week only to know the fruit of your labor. Then let them go to fern. The strength is still for the roots. It also instructed me to fill the trenches to the top with the last of my soil mixture. That first week of harvest was a private, sacred thing. I took a sharp knife and a basket out each morning. The sound the knife made as it sliced through the base of a spear was a crisp, satisfying snap. I cut only the thickest spears, leaving the thinner ones to grow. Every day for a week, I harvested a small bunch. Not enough to sell, but enough for my kitchen. I steamed them with a little butter and a pinch of salt. The flavor was incredible. It was clean and green and sweet, with none of the woody bitterness that store-bought asparagus sometimes has. It was the taste of success. It was the taste of vindication. After that 1 week, as much as it pained me, I stopped cutting. I filled the trenches the rest of the way, bringing the soil level with the surrounding ground. And I watched as the remaining spears, and the new ones that shot up, grew into a dense, towering forest of fern. This year, they didn't stop at 2 feet. They grew to 3, then 4, then 5 feet tall. The north slope was transformed. From the road, you could no longer see the pale, sick-looking ground. You saw a lush, vibrant 2-acre rectangle of deep green waving in the summer breeze. It was the healthiest-looking piece of land on the whole farm. That summer, Sarah's nephew came to visit. He was a young man named Kevin, a graduate student in soil science at the State University. Sarah, proud of my project, had told him all about it, and he'd arrived full of academic curiosity and armed with an impressive array of modern gadgets. He had a digital pH meter, a soil moisture probe, and a device called a penetrometer, which measures soil compaction. He was polite and respectful, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He saw an old woman with a quaint story. He wanted data. "Do you mind if I take some readings?" he asked. "I'm fascinated by the anecdotal results." "Help yourself," I said. He spent the whole afternoon on the north slope. First, he took readings from the undug ground between my rows. The results were just what he and I expected. The pH was acidic, around 5.8. The moisture reading was low on the surface, but jumped way up at the clay layer, showing it was waterlogged below. And the penetrometer met so much resistance at 8 inches that he couldn't push it any further by hand. "Classic compacted clay loam," he announced. "Just what the soil maps for this area predict." Then he moved to my planted rows. He pushed the probes into the dark, rich soil. He stared at the readings on his digital devices. He frowned. He did it again in a different spot. And again. He was quiet for a long time. "What is it?" I finally asked. He looked up at me, a puzzled expression on his face. "The pH is almost neutral. It's 6.8. That's perfect for asparagus. The wood ash, I guess. The moisture reading. It's consistent. It's moist all the way down, but not wet. It's like a wrung-out sponge." He shook his head and looked at the most impressive tool, the penetrometer. "But this is the thing that doesn't make sense." He calibrated the device and pushed it into the soil of the row. It slid down smoothly, down past 8 inches, past 12, past 24. He pushed it all the way to its 30-inch maximum, and it still hadn't met significant resistance. "That's impossible," he muttered, pulling it out. "This soil has the compaction profile of a raised bed made of potting mix. But it's native clay. You've somehow, without machinery, fundamentally and permanently altered the structure of the soil column down to at least 3 feet. My professors would say this takes decades of cover cropping or thousands of dollars in amendments and tilling. You did it in a month with a shovel." He looked from his instrument to the towering green ferns, then back to me. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated respect. "It's the stones," he said, thinking out loud. "You created a hyporeic zone, a drainage channel. It allows the entire soil column above it to breathe. It wicks away excess moisture in wet weather, and because the soil isn't compacted, it can draw up moisture in dry weather. It's a perfectly balanced, self-regulating system. I've read about this in old agronomy textbooks from the 30s. It's called deep soil modification. I've never seen it in practice. Nobody does this anymore. It's too much work.